In 2016, a research vessel was scanning the bottom of the Arctic Ocean just south of King William Island. The water there is freezing, utterly dark, and incredibly clear. On the sonar screen, a shape appeared. It wasn't a rock formation. It wasn't a whale carcass. It was a ship. It was the HMS Terror. And the terrifying thing about the Terror wasn't that it was destroyed. It was that it wasn't. The ship was sitting upright on the seabed. The hull was intact. The windows of the captain's cabin were still unbroken. Plates were still sitting on shelves. If you could somehow pump the water out, you got the feeling that you could just light the stove, raise the anchor, and sail her away. She had been sitting there in the freezing dark for 170 years, waiting. Tonight, we are talking about the Franklin expedition. It is the gold standard of historical horror stories. It is the story of two state-of-the-art ships, 129 hand-picked men, and a 3-year supply of food, vanishing into the white void without a trace. But to understand the horror, we first have to understand the arrogance, because this wasn't a tragedy of bad luck. It was a tragedy of hubris. The year is 1845. The British Empire is feeling good about itself. The map of the world is almost filled in. They have charted the coast of Australia, the jungles of Africa, the rivers of India. But there is one annoying blank space left at the top of the map: the Northwest Passage. The British Admiralty decided that they were going to brute force this problem. They weren't going to send explorers who lived off the land like the Inuit. They were going to send a machine. They were going to build a piece of England that could float through hell. They chose 2 ships, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror. Even the names were heavy. Erebus, the personification of darkness in Greek mythology. Terror, well, that one explains itself. These were not graceful schooners, they were bomb vessels. They had been built for war, designed to withstand the recoil of massive mortars firing cannonballs at coastal forts. They were thick, squat, and incredibly strong. The engineers took these floating fortresses and turned them into the 19th century equivalent of a spaceship. They reinforced the bows with sheets of iron so they could smash through ice. They installed steam engines taken from railway locomotives, connected to a retractable screw propeller. This was cutting-edge tech. The idea was that if the wind died, the ships could just chug their way through the calm. But the real marvel was the interior. The Admiralty wanted the officers to be comfortable. They installed a central heating system, a network of pipes that ran hot water through the cabins to keep the temperature at a cozy 60 degrees, even if it was 40 below zero outside. They packed fine china, they packed cut glass decanters. They packed a library of over 1,000 books, novels, Bibles, engineering manuals. They packed a hand-cranked barrel organ so they could have music on Sunday mornings. They brought silver cutlery with the officers' crests engraved on the handles. It was a floating Victorian parlor. The message was clear. We are not going to adapt to the Arctic. The Arctic is going to adapt to us. The man chosen to lead this parade was Sir John Franklin. He was 59 years old. He was a kindness, gentle man, deeply religious, and arguably a little too old for the job. He was known as the man who ate his boots because of a previous disastrous expedition where he had nearly starved to death. You would think that experience would have made him cautious. Instead, it just gave him a sense of unfinished business. In May 1845, the fleet set sail from Greenhithe, England. The mood was electric. Crowds cheered. The press declared the expedition unsinkable. They carried 8,000 tins of preserved meat, vegetables, and soup, enough food to last for 3 years. And this is where the horror begins, not with a monster, but with a contract. The contract for the tinned food was given to a man named Stefan Goldner. He was the lowest bidder. He had to produce 8,000 cans in a rush. The inspection was rushed, the sealing was rushed. Inside the hulls of the Erebus and the Terror, ticking away like a time bomb, was tons of meat that hadn't been cooked properly, sealed with cheap lead solder that would slowly drip poison into the gravy. But nobody knew that yet.
The ships crossed the Atlantic. They stopped in Greenland to offload letters home. The crew wrote to their wives and mothers. They were cheerful. One officer wrote, "I have no doubt we will be in the Pacific by next summer." In late July 1845, 2 whaling ships in Baffin Bay saw the Erebus and the Terror tied to an iceberg, waiting for the path to clear. The captains waved to each other. The whalers sailed east back home. Franklin turned his ships west into Lancaster Sound. They sailed into the white mist, and they were never seen by white men again. The first year went according to plan. The ships made good progress, charting new islands, feeling their way through the labyrinth of ice. When winter came in late 1845, they did what Arctic explorers always do. They wintered over. They found a sheltered bay at a place called Beachy Island. The ocean froze around them, locking the ships in solid ice. This was expected. You turn off the engines, you put up the canvas awnings over the deck, and you live in your warm, heated wooden cave until summer. But something was wrong at Beachy Island. That first winter, 3 men died. Private John Torrington, Private William Brain, and able seaman John Hartnell. This was unusual. These were young, healthy men. They shouldn't have been dying of tuberculosis or pneumonia this early in the trip. But they did. Their shipmates buried them on the frozen beach. They dug deep into the permafrost, which is like digging into concrete, and laid them to rest. In the 1980s, anthropologists dug them up to see why they died. And because of the permafrost, the men were perfectly preserved, not as skeletons, but as sleeping men. John Torrington still had his eyes open, staring up at the frozen sky. But the crew of 1846 didn't panic. Men died on ships. It happened. When the ice melted in the summer of 1846, Franklin ordered the ships south. He was aiming for King William Island. His maps told him, or suggested to him, that if he could just get past this island, the route to the mainland was clear. He would have a straight shot to the Pacific. So the Erebus and the Terror fired up their locomotive engines. Black smoke poured into the pristine Arctic air. They smashed their way down the Peel Sound. They were making history. They were winning. And then in September 1846, the temperature dropped. The sea began to thicken. It turns into what sailors call grease ice, a slush that kills the waves. Then it becomes pancake ice, floating discs that bang against the hull. And then the pancakes merge. Within days, the ocean was gone. The Erebus and the Terror were frozen in. This, again, was part of the plan. They would wait out the winter of 1846, and when the summer of 1847 came, the ice would melt, and they would finish the journey. But the Arctic is not a machine. You cannot predict it. The winter of 1846 was brutal. The sun went down in November and didn't come back until February. For 3 months, the men lived in total darkness, trapped in the wooden belly of the ship. Imagine the sound. When a ship is frozen in pack ice, it isn't silent. The ice moves, it shifts, it squeezes. The hull groans, it sounds like a dying animal screaming. The timbers pop like gunshots. Inside, the central heating kept them warm, but the air was stale. They read the books in the library over and over. They performed plays. They tried to keep up British standards. They set the table with silver. They pretended they were in a club in London, but they weren't in London. They were in a white desert, thousands of miles from help. And the summer of 1847 never came. The sun rose, but the heat didn't. The ice didn't melt. The leads, cracks of open water, didn't open. The ships remained locked in a vise of frozen ocean, miles off the coast of King William Island. And now the time bomb in the hull began to detonate. The food, the lead solder, the lack of fresh meat. Scurvy began to loosen their teeth. Old wounds reopened, and a strange creeping lethargy began to take over the minds of the officers. And then, the unthinkable happened. In June 1847, Sir John Franklin, the leader, the father figure, the man who was supposed to get them home, died. We don't know how. The only record we have is a single piece of paper found years later in a cairn of stones. It simply says, Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. The command fell to Captain Francis Crozier of the Terror. Crozier was a grim, competent Irishman. He wasn't an optimist like Franklin. He looked at the ice and he looked at the food stores, and he realized the terrifying truth. The ships weren't going to be released. The ice wasn't letting go. They were trapped in a coffin of their own making, and the only way out was to walk. The second winter is always worse than the first. The human mind is resilient. It can handle a crisis. It can handle a storm. But what it struggles to handle is stasis. By late 1847, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had been frozen in the ice for over a year. They hadn't moved a single inch. The steam engines were cold. The coal was being rationed. The view from the portholes never changed, just endless, shifting, gray-white ridges of ice stretching to the horizon. Inside the ships, the atmosphere had shifted from Victorian parlor to something much darker. The death of Sir John Franklin in June had broken the spell. The men weren't explorers anymore, they were prisoners. And something was happening to them. Something insidious. If you read the medical textbooks of the time, they talk about scurvy as a physical disease. Your gums bleed, your old scars open up, your joints swell. And the crew certainly had that. The lemon juice they had brought, thousands of gallons of it, had lost its potency after 3 years in casks. It was useless. But there was another sickness on board, one that the doctors couldn't diagnose. The men were becoming erratic. They were becoming paranoid. Officers who were known for their discipline started having outbursts of rage. Reliable seamen started seeing things in the dark. For decades, historians blamed this on cabin fever. But in the 1980s, when scientists analyzed the hair and bone samples of the crewmen found on Beechy Island, they found the culprit: lead. The samples contained lead levels that were off the charts, 10 times the lethal dose. The crew wasn't just starving, they were suffering from severe heavy metal poisoning. And the irony, the grim, industrial irony, was that the poison was coming from their modern survival technology. Remember those 8,000 tins of food? The soup, the beef, the mutton that was supposed to keep them alive? The manufacturer, Stephen Goldner, had rushed the job. To seal the cans faster, the factory workers had slopped thick ridges of molten lead solder into the seams. Every time a sailor opened a can of soup and heated it up, he was drinking a cocktail of neurotoxins. Lead poisoning doesn't kill you quickly. It attacks the brain first. It causes confusion, memory loss, aggression, and hallucinations. So picture the scene in the winter of 1847. You are trapped in a wooden box in 24-hour darkness. The temperature outside is -50. The ice is screaming against the hull, and everyone around you, including yourself, is slowly going insane. The order and hierarchy of the Royal Navy began to fray. Captain Francis Crozier, now in command, watched his crew deteriorating. Crozier was a realist. He knew the ships were dead. The ice around King William Island is notorious, and it flows down from the north and piles up, creating a pressure ridge that locks everything in place for years. They weren't going to sail out. If they stayed on the ships for a third winter, everyone would be dead. So, in April 1848, Crozier made the decision that every captain dreads. He ordered the men to abandon ship. This was a massive psychological break. To a sailor, the ship is life. The ship is heat, walls, safety. Outside is death. To voluntarily walk down the gangplank and step onto the frozen ocean is an act of desperation. On Good Friday, April 22, 1848, 105 surviving men evacuated the Erebus and the Terror. They unloaded the supplies onto the ice. They weren't prepared for travel. They didn't have lightweight dog sleds or fur parkas like the Inuit. They had heavy woolen naval uniforms, great for a rainy night in Portsmouth, terrible for hauling gear across an ice field. And they had sledges, massive heavy wooden boats mounted on iron runners. These things weighed nearly a ton when loaded. They were designed to be pulled by teams of men in harnesses like human draft horses. Before they left, they did one final administrative task. They left a record. At a place called Victory Point on the shore of King William Island, they built a cairn of stones. Inside, they placed a sealed tin canister containing a single piece of standard Admiralty paper. This document, the Victory Point Note, is the only written record ever recovered from the expedition. It tells the story in calm, bureaucratic handwriting. It lists the coordinates. It mentions the death of Franklin. But then, scrawled in the margins, upside down and messy, is a second message added later by Crozier and his second-in-command James Fitzjames. It reads, HMS Terror and Erebus were deserted on the 22nd April, having been beset since the 12th September, 1846. The officers and crews consisting of 105 souls, under the command of Captain F.R.M. Crozier, land here. And then the final chilling sentence. Start on tomorrow the 26th, for the Great Fish River. They were going to walk. They were going to drag these one-ton sledges hundreds of miles south, across the sea ice, to the mouth of the Back River, then called the Great Fish River on the Canadian mainland. From there they hoped to row upriver to a trading post. It was a death march. Even healthy men with proper gear would struggle to make that journey. These men were half-starved, riddled with scurvy, and poisoning themselves with lead. But they didn't know that. They still believed in the system. They still believed that if they followed orders and pulled hard enough, the Empire would save them. And this brings us to the most heartbreaking aspect of the Franklin expedition. The luggage. When archaeologists later found the trail of these men, they were baffled by what the crew chose to take with them. If you were walking for your life across an Arctic wasteland, you take food, fuel, and ammunition. That's it. But the Franklin crew? They packed the sledges with stuff. They packed heavy mahogany desks. They packed silver cutlery, hundreds of pounds of forks and spoons engraved with the officers' crests. They packed curtain rods. They packed a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield. They packed button polish. Why? Why would a starving man drag a 50-pound box of silver spoons until his heart exploded? Because the silver was civilization. The silver was proof that they were still gentlemen of the Royal Navy. If they left the silver behind, they were just animals dying in the snow. If they kept the silver, they were still men. It was a delusion, a fatal, tragic delusion. The column of 105 men began to move south. It must have looked like a dark stain moving across the white ice. They moved painfully slowly, maybe a mile or two a day. The heavy sledges cut into the snow. The men in the harnesses coughed up blood. As they walked, the discipline began to crack. The weaker men began to fall behind. They would sit down on the ice to rest and simply never get up. The cold is a gentle killer in the end. It makes you sleepy. And as the hunger set in, the British standards began to evaporate. The silver spoons didn't matter anymore. The rank didn't matter anymore. And out there in the white darkness, the crew of the Franklin expedition finally met the locals. For years, the British had ignored the Inuit. They considered them savages. But the Inuit were the masters of this environment. They watched the strangers dragging their heavy boats. They saw the madness of it. Inuit oral history, passed down through generations, tells of meeting a group of white men pulling a boat. The leader, Agluka, they called him, likely Crozier, tried to communicate. He made signs that they were hungry. The Inuit gave them some seal meat, but there were too many of them. The Inuit realized that these men were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. To stay and help would mean starving their own families. So the Inuit vanished into the snow, leaving the Ghost Fleet's crew to their fate. And as the food ran out completely, the men of the Royal Navy crossed the final line. The line that separates civilization from the abyss. They looked at the bodies of the men who had fallen, and they realized that there was still meat on the sledges. It wasn't beef, it wasn't mutton, but it was protein. The archaeological evidence is undeniable. On the bones found at the final campsites, there are pot polish marks, signs that the ends of the bones were rubbed against cooking pots to extract the marrow. There are cut marks consistent with butchery. The pride of the British Empire, the men who brought a barrel organ and a library to the Arctic, ended their journey huddled in makeshift tents, gnawing on the bones of their friends. When the news of the expedition's disappearance finally reached London, the public refused to accept the worst. Lady Jane Franklin, Sir John's wife, became a national icon of grief and determination. She spent her entire fortune funding rescue missions. She lobbied the Admiralty, the American president, and even the Tsar of Russia to send ships to find her husband. For 10 years, the Arctic was crowded with search parties, but they found nothing. Just the empty white silence. It wasn't until 1854 that a surveyor named John Ray returned with the first real information. Ray was different from other British explorers. He respected the Inuit. He learned their language, wore their clothes, and traveled light. And because he listened, the Inuit told him the truth. They told him about the white men who fell down and died as they walked. They showed him items they had scavenged from the bodies, a silver watch, a medal, a fork with Franklin's crest. And then they told him the detail that would destroy John Ray's career. They told him that many of the bodies had been mutilated. They told him that in the final camp there were boots filled with cooked human flesh. They told him that the Kabluna, the white men, had eaten each other. Ray, being an honest man, put this in his report to the Admiralty. The reaction in Victorian England was explosive. It was furious. The idea that British officers, Christian gentlemen, would resort to cannibalism was unthinkable. It was a slur against the national character. Charles Dickens, the most famous writer in the world, wrote a scathing article attacking John Ray. He argued that the Inuit were liars by nature, and that Franklin's men would have died with noble stoicism, rather than violate the laws of God and man. The Empire closed ranks. They buried the truth. They erected statues to Franklin, the tragic hero who forged the passage. They ignored the cannibalism. They ignored the lead poisoning. They ignored the hubris, and the Arctic slowly reclaimed the evidence. The snow covered the bones, the ice crushed the sledges. The cairn at Victory Point sat undisturbed for years until it was finally opened by Lieutenant Hobson in 1859, revealing the Victory Point Note, the death certificate of the expedition. But the ships, the Erebus and the Terror, remained missing. For over a century and a half, they were the Holy Grail of shipwrecks. They were the ghost ships of the North. Then came the 21st century, and with it, climate change. As the Arctic ice began to thin and recede, the waters around King William Island opened up. In 2014, a Canadian search team working closely with Inuit historians, whose oral testimony turned out to be more accurate than the Admiralty maps, found the wreck of the HMS Erebus. It was sitting in shallow water, crushed by the ice but still identifiable. 2 years later, in 2016, they found the Terror, and the location of the Terror rewrote the end of the story. The note at Victory Point said the ships were abandoned in 1848, north of the island. But the wreck of the Terror was found 60 miles south, in a sheltered bay appropriately named Terror Bay. Ships don't sail themselves. The ice doesn't drift into that specific bay. This implies a final, desperate twist to the tragedy. It suggests that after the death march failed, after the cannibalism and the madness, a handful of survivors might have crawled back to the ships. They might have remanned the Terror, fired up the engine one last time, and tried to sail her out. Imagine being that last man. You have watched 128 of your friends die. You have eaten them to survive. You have dragged a sledge across hell and back. And now, you are back in the ship. The heating is dead. The silence is absolute. You are the last living soul in the entire archipelago. The ship sinks, and you go down with it, sitting in the dark, surrounded by the useless silver spoons and the unopened books. The discovery of the ships confirmed what the Inuit had said all along. It vindicated John Ray, but it also served as a grim time capsule of 1845, when divers sent ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, down into the Terror. They peered through the windows of the officers' cabins. The silt had preserved everything. They saw bottles of wine still standing on shelves. They saw desks with drawers closed, potentially still holding the logbooks that could explain everything. We are still waiting for them to be recovered. It is a frozen museum of failure. The Franklin expedition is more than just a shipwreck story. It is a lesson in the limits of technology. We like to think that we can conquer nature. We build better ships, better planes, better suits. We think that if we just bring enough stuff, enough heating systems and tinned food, we can ignore the environment. But the Arctic doesn't care about your steam engines. It doesn't care about your silver cutlery. It is a filter. If you respect it, if you adapt to it, like the Inuit, you survive. If you try to fight it with hubris, it will simply wait. It will wait until your coal runs out. It will wait until your lead solder poisons your mind. And then it will close the ice around you and keep you forever. The Erebus and the Terror are still down there, designated as National Historic Sites. They are the tombs of the men who thought they could tame the white darkness. And, in a way, they finally did complete their mission. They didn't find the passage in life, but in death, they became part of the geography eternal markers on the map they died trying to draw. So the next time you feel frustrated that your Wi-Fi is slow or your flight is delayed, just remember Captain Crozier. Remember the sound of the ice screaming against the hull. Remember the taste of the lead. And be grateful for the boring, warm, predictable world you live in. Thank you for listening to this frosty little nightmare. I'm going to go turn up the thermostat and make some very hot tea. Sleep well, and stay out of the cold.